Welcome to this wonderful occasion. My name is Linda Bell. I'm the Provost and Dean of the Faculty, and it's my honor and my privilege to be here today in several ways. First, I see today as honoring an age-old tradition of academia, which is the notion of celebrating great scholarship and celebrating the generosity of those around us who make our scholarship possible. This is, as all of you know, the tenured inaugural lecture for Beth Berkowitz, who is the Renner Professor of Religion. And institutions like Barnard could not survive without the generosity of a very large community. We couldn't survive without fabulous scholarship and engaged discourse, and we couldn't survive without new people, new ideas, new disciplines, and really the intensity of wonderful writing and scholarship exemplified by Beth. So it's really my honor to be here today to start off this evening. Thank you all for being here. Beth, I've read a bit of your work, and I am really looking forward to hear a bit of your work. I'm going to introduce next Janet Jakobsen, the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, who will give a few introductory remarks as well. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. This is part of the Barnard Center for Research on Women fall programming series. And as Linda said, we are particularly honored to be hosting this event because it's our chance to officially and publicly welcome our new colleague, Beth Berkowitz. We could not be more thrilled. You're going to hear that about 6 times before she actually gets to speak. And that is simply an expression of how thrilled we are to have her here and what an important addition to Barnard's research and teaching community Beth joining us represents. So first of all, I think we should just clap for Beth Berkowitz right away. The thing I most want to highlight about this forum, which is the Ingeborg, Tamara, and Jonina Renner Forum on Women in Judaism, is that this is an opportunity to take the forum to a new level, to start it anew. It has a great history to it already, and if you're interested in that, you can find it online at the BCRW website. There are lectures, past lectures by scholars like Ruth Behar and by community members and also Barnard alums like Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Troster. So I encourage you to go to the website and see those previous lectures, and also to go to our web journal, The Scholar and Feminist Online, which has a record of a major conference that we had called Jewish Women Changing America, Cross-Generational Conversations. So I can say that the past of this forum has been exemplary, but I think that with Beth's leadership, it will be truly wonderful and exciting in the years to come. So I encourage you to come every year to participate in the forum and get involved as much as you can, because I think this is the start of something truly special, and I'm glad that you're here to join us tonight at the start. And so it's now my great pleasure to introduce our colleague, the chair of the Religion Department, John Hawley, who I like to think of as a friend of the Barnard Center for Research on Women over his many years here, who will introduce Beth. John.
Tonight, we celebrate our great good fortune in being able formally and publicly to welcome Beth Berkowitz to the Ingeborg Renner Professorship of Religion and Jewish Studies at Barnard College. Ingeborg and Ira Renner have been extremely generous to Barnard, not only providing us with this crucial and prestigious fellowship, but also, as Janet has said, in envisioning the Renner Women in Judaism Forum, whose mission is to promote the public's understanding of the complex roles of women in Judaism, both past and present. It is named after 3 formidable Renner women, Ingeborg herself and her 2 daughters, Tamara and Jonina, both of whom are Barnard graduates. Nina now brings that female family forum, in fact, to Barnard on a regular basis as a member of our Board of Trustees. It was Alan Segal, a cherished friend to many in this room, who was inaugurated the first Renner professor in 1999, shortly after Tamara and Nina graduated from Barnard. No one who knew Alan will ever forget the range of his knowledge or the extent of his schmoozability. But the twinkle in that eye now has become so much a part of the Barnard Renner professorship that in some magical way it has crossed a fence or two and landed you know where. You'll soon see that in the face and in the manner and in the utter alertness, I would say, of Beth Berkowitz. In Beth, like Alan, we have the best sort of marriage between the study of religion, broadly speaking, and the study of Judaism in particular. But there is, I have to concede, one difference. The Renner Women in Judaism Forum will now be directed by, you guessed it, a woman. Women in Judaism, when you say these words, many fields come to mind, at least come to my mind. Business and law, politics and philanthropy, now I'm thinking of my wife, poetry and prose. And within the specific domain of religion, ritual studies, historical formation, literature, song, and story in Hebrew and many languages, often simultaneously. But there's one black hole, or awfully dark in any case until recently, and that is the core of Jewish learning, the Talmud. So far, very few women have gone there. Beth is a leader among them. Beth graduated from Columbia as a religion major, magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. She then pursued an MA at Chicago and, thank goodness, came back here to take her PhD under the great Talmudist David Weiss-Salivni. Her thesis, which was received with distinction, went on to become her first book, Execution and Invention. It concerns the very inventive topic of, and now I quote the subtitle, Death Penalty Discourse in Early Rabbinic and Christian Culture. This book received the coveted Segal Baron Prize for Outstanding First Book in Jewish Studies from the American Academy of Jewish Research in 2007. Oxford was the publisher, so of course, Beth went on to publish her second book from Cambridge. It's called Defining Jewish Difference from Antiquity to the Present, 2012. The scope is huge, as the title implies, and again, it's about Jews and more than Jews. But lest you think you may have left the Talmud behind, let me assure you that in good Talmudic style, these 250-odd some pages, widely called a tour de force, are guided by the study and reception and reverberations of a single verse in the Torah, Leviticus 18:3. Now, in Beth's third major project, we have a further major shift. It's on beyond Goyim to, what else? Animals. This time, Beth engages the whole new field of animal studies, probably the first Talmudist to do so in a serious way. In describing her approach to teaching, which was developed at Columbia first, then at Penn and at Yale, and most recently at JTS, from whom we shamelessly stole Beth, Beth emphasizes the Talmudist inside her. In the classroom, she says, and I quote, "My style is interactive and conversational. I listen, I respond, I think out loud, I change my mind." Tonight, we have the great privilege of hearing Beth Berkowitz think out loud. Whether, in fact, she will change her mind as she talks to us, I cannot say. But I'm willing to wager that we will. Please join me in welcoming Beth Berkowitz to the Renner Chair at Barnard.
I really want to thank Provost Bell and that wonderful introduction from Jack and Janet Jakobsen. I also have to mention Ann Jonas, who has really done so much to plan this evening. I wanted to start by describing a faculty meeting that I went to in the spring. Now, people don't usually think of faculty meetings as moving experiences, but I had a bit of a moving experience at this faculty meeting. The topic of all topics was fundraising, and there was one member of the faculty who asked President Spar a good, simple question, which was, what are the challenges that Barnard faces when it tries to fundraise? So to answer that question, President Spar gave some Barnard history. She said, unlike some Ivy League schools founded by wealthy men for wealthy men, that Barnard's history was different, that Barnard had opened its doors early on to the poor Jewish women of New York City, and that those women were its clientele. So sitting at that meeting, really felt proud to be part of that history of hospitality towards the Jewish girls of New York City. But I have to say, very, very happy not all those Jewish women were poor and without resources, because we wouldn't be here tonight if some of those women who have come through these doors did not have resources that they were willing to share with Barnard. So I wanted to thank the Renner family for their generosity in sharing their resources with Barnard. With their help, Barnard can continue to open its doors to the Jewish women of New York City and to many other women, of course. And I, as the Renner Chair of Jewish Studies, plan to make sure that the study of Jewish women becomes a fixture in the Barnard curriculum. So while we're on the subject of faculty meetings that are oddly moving, I wanted to mention my amazing departments who's clustered right here. All our department meetings, you should know, end with this big love fest in the department where we all tell each other how lucky we are to work together and how privileged we are to have been thrown together. It's kind of weird, actually. So I just want to thank them and to tell them how happy I am to get to work with them and to have so much fun with them. Okay, so on to my topic for tonight. I'm going to start with a Mishnah that may be the most shocking Mishnah in the corpus. So don't say I didn't warn you as we look at this Mishnah. One does not lodge an animal in the inns of the nations because they are suspect for bestiality. And a woman does not spend time alone with them because they are suspect for sexual violations. And a human being does not spend time alone with them because they are suspect for shedding blood. It's the first Mishnah of the second chapter of Tractate Avodah Zarah. For those unfamiliar, the Mishnah is a 2nd century legal collection composed in the land of Israel in Hebrew language. This Mishnah that I just read to you prohibits private relationships between Jews and Gentiles, and it uses some inflammatory rhetoric to do so. So I wanted to talk to you about the rhetorical strategies that this Mishnah uses, and to focus on some of those. The first focus, the central binary in this Mishnah is not, as you would expect, between the nations and the Jews, or the nations and Israel. Rather, it's between the nations and a human being, Adam. Israel and human are implicitly identified here. Second rhetorical strategy. The Mishnah doesn't claim that all the nations are going to commit bestiality, rape, and murder, just that they're suspect for it. This line, since they're suspect, repeats in almost liturgical fashion throughout this Mishnah. Finally, there is the power asymmetry presumed within this Mishnah, which imagines the Gentile overpowering the Jew. Jewish males are portrayed as potential victims of physical violence, while Jewish females are portrayed as potential victims of sexual violence. So how can we read this Mishnah? How can we make sense of it? What is its project? Let me offer a few plausible ways to understand what this Mishnah is up to. The first, a kind of straight historicist reading, would say this Mishnah simply reflects a reality of violence in Roman Palestine. these kinds of attacks were happening, and the rabbis are just addressing that reality. I think the representation here is extreme enough that we feel we want to probe a little bit further with that. A more psychological reading, focusing on the dynamics of projection, would see this Mishnah projecting onto Gentiles precisely those desires, transgressive desires, that rabbis feel most uncomfortable seeing in themselves. And you could say, well, that's a little out there as an interpretation, but there's an interesting text that comes up in Mishnah Kiddushin. It actually restricts Jews from sleeping with other Jews and spending time alone with certain women and with young people and with animals. So you have the same kinds of concerns playing out when it's just Jews with Jews. A third reading, rooted in the cultural dynamics of Roman Palestine, would see in this Mishnah, this is probably the reading that pops out the most, as a project on the part of separatist rabbis to keep Jews and Gentiles apart. But a more radical version that's suggested by recent historiography of Roman Palestine suggests it may not have been so easy in Roman Palestine to even tell apart a Jew from a Gentile, in which case this direction to spend time separately gets complicated if it seems it wasn't even so clear who was Jewish and who was Gentile. This Mishnah works so hard to construct Jewish-Gentile difference that you can almost forget that there are other kinds of differences being negotiated here as well. Tonight, this evening, I want to shift the focus away from the Jew-Gentile binary and also the male-female binary to look at another binary that I've become more interested in the past few years. This is the binary of human-animal. It's not just the Jewish man and the Jewish woman who appear to be threatened by the Gentile, but it's also the Jewish animal. When I teach this Mishnah, I like to ask the students, I don't actually know the answer to the question, so it's kind of a trick question. I like to ask them, how do you think the Mishnah is organized? Is it in ascending or descending degrees of severity? When it goes from animal to woman to man, are we supposed to get increasingly shocked or decreasingly shocked? But what I want to consider tonight is, who is this animal? What is at stake with the animal? And what readings will help us to lay this bare? So here's the plan for the evening. I want to first discuss this emerging field of scholarship known as animal studies, and I want to tell you what I think are its main concerns and what I think are its main challenges. Then, I want to think about how animal studies can cross-fertilize with Jewish studies more generally, but also specifically with my fields, with rabbinics. And then I want to start doing a little bit of that work, to actually look at a different Mishnah, and to start bringing the insights from animal studies to bear on that Mishnah. And then I'd like us to eat and to drink and to have a nice reception. That's the last part of the plan. Okay, trying to give an overview of the burgeoning area known as animal studies is a bit like herding cats, says Carrie Wolf with conscious irony. Wolf traces animal studies back to the 70s and the 80s with Peter Singer's classic 1975 Animal Liberation. Many parallels have been drawn between animal studies and race and gender studies, all of which arose around the same time, and all of which had associated with them activist political movements. The deconstruction of the human-animal binary, probably more so than race and gender, was really fueled by science and new scientific research that claimed that other species, and this is kind of coming out every day in the Science Times, I love to read this stuff, that other species have cognition and even culture comparable to that of human beings. The reverberations of this research have been felt across the humanities to the point that animal studies scholars, at least some of them, now call for something that we should call a post-humanities that avoids the anthropocentrism of that category, humanities. This tendency harks back less to Peter Singer from the 70s, more to Derrida in a famous 9-hour lecture that he gave, unbelievable, which the premise for was that he was standing naked in front of his cat, and that sent him into reveries that he captured in this lecture. So here are 4 key insights or claims of animal studies as I see it. The entity known as the animal may be rooted in some degree of biological difference, but it's a culturally determined and variable notion that homogenizes highly diverse life forms. 2, the discourse of species difference, so that dichotomy, human-animal, facilitates a set of power relations between our species and all other species. 3, the discourse of species difference facilitates a set of power relations, not just between our species and other species, but within our species. And what I want to focus on here is the strategy of animalizing people. You could probably come up with examples from popular culture. What came to my head were Playboy bunnies, or the slur, a bitch, turning a woman into a dog. So we do this all the time. I think we do it so much, we don't even notice that we're doing it. The converse, though, of animalizing people is anthropomorphizing animals. And we do this all the time to the point where we don't notice it. You can think of, and this probably shows my dating, like younger students have a whole different set of references, but Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, lots of kid stuff uses that strategy. Sometimes, though, anthropomorphizing animals can actually be a productive way for us to imagine the experience of other species and to engage our own animality, our own physicality, and our own mortality. But I'd have to say more frequently, anthropomorphism probably involves an erasure of animal experience and denial, too, of our own experience as animals. Here's how I want to break down 4 challenges, as I see it, within animal studies. First, this is the postmodern dilemma par excellence. If we can never gain unmediated access to reality, to anything, to real animals in this case, should one bother with them? Should we just look at the represented animal, at how we think about animals? But here's the problem. What are the ethical costs of just looking at our own representations and not engaging actual, real, living individual animals? A related challenge is scholarship and activism. How do those 2 things come together? Should they come together? What is the role of animal studies in the political arena, and vice versa? Peter Singer, in his 1975 first edition of Animal Liberation, included a recipe for lentil soup. It was philosophy wedded to practice. But you have other scholars, another scholar, actually an animal studies scholar, talks about wearing a leather jacket to an animal studies conference as a sign of his past, his unreconstructed past. Carrie Wolf provocatively says that it doesn't make a darn difference if you like animals or not to do animal studies. But many animal studies scholars, I would include myself among them, do care about and engage the current realities of animal slaughter, animal experimentation, and are concerned with the treatments of real live animals. Finally, how do we think about animal studies as an academic area? Is it a sub-area of cultural studies, like race studies, like gender studies, or is it, as I mentioned before, supposed to be some kind of global intellectual paradigm shift, changing the humanities in every possible way? Post-humanities proponents argue that this is what animal studies must do. It must not, if it's true to itself, reinscribe the humanist schema of a knowing human subject who is uniquely capable of introspection, critical analysis, self-reflection, who paternalistically explains some passive object of knowledge. And then finally, and relatedly, some animals, this is probably the part I find most challenging, animal studies proponents who criticize that animal studies hasn't gone far enough in its focus on mammals. We tend to be most interested in the animals that are most like us. But an animal studies that takes microbes as seriously as mammals would be a true paradigm shift. So goes that argument. Okay, so that's animal studies. Let me start talking about how I see all this connecting to Jewish studies and to rabbinics. These problems in animal studies raise a lot of important questions for religious studies, for Jewish studies, and specifically for rabbinic literature. Animals are ubiquitous in rabbinic law. There's the obvious stuff: slaughtering animals, sacrificing animals, eating animals. But there's lots of areas of Mishnaic law that you wouldn't even necessarily come up with, but they're all there. There's buying, selling, owning, inheriting, stealing, judging, worshiping. We saw having sex with animals. There's using them for work. There's using them to gamble with. There's using them for such a wide variety of purposes. It behooves us scholars, no pun intended, us scholars of ancient Judaism, to understand how all these animals are working there. How do they function in the legal system? The standard storyline about the rabbis goes something like this. The temple was destroyed in 70, making it impossible to continue the priesthood and the animal sacrifice, and the rabbis create a new religion that's not based on animal sacrifices. The motto is from temple to table. But it hasn't really been explored. What happens to animals in this major religious shift? There's a Scandinavian scholar who's done great work asking these questions for early Christianity. And there are a number of classicists who've been asking these questions for the same period in Greek philosophy. And there was just a conference this past year I saw on animals in Islam. But it seems to me that rabbinic Judaism is really lagging in asking these kinds of questions. But here's how rabbinics, so that's how animal studies can help us. But how is rabbinics going to help animal studies? What do we contribute to that world? Peter Singer saw Western religion as the enemy in his fight for animal liberation. And you would be surprised how little the terms have advanced since his writing on religion's role in animal oppression. So the terms of the debate tend to be, is Judaism good for the animal? Is it bad for the animal? What can we learn from the first 2 chapters of Genesis and looking how the first human was created and how his relationship to the other species is fashioned? Or how can we look at the kashrut laws, at the dietary laws, and draw conclusions? There's a lot of great animal studies for modern culture. very sophisticated, talking about modern film and Victorian literature, but that kind of work has not been done for early rabbinic Judaism, or even for Jewish studies in general. It's just starting to seep through. So animal studies itself is missing this very important chapter of Judaism in its story of animal representation. Okay, so let me start doing the kind of work that so far I've been talking about. Here's a Mishnah that I'd like us to discuss, and I have another warning about the Mishnah I'm going to teach. Different kind of warning. The first Mishnah I started with is morally offensive. This one is just impossible to understand. So as I read through it, just know that you're not going to get it unless you happen to have studied this before. It's not going to make sense. But here's my goal. By the end of this talk, it will make some sense. So that's my hope. Okay, here's the Mishnah. There are 5 innocent sources of damage and 5 attested sources of damage. An animal is not attested as a source of damage with respect to goring, butting, biting, squatting, or kicking. I really like saying that. It's fun. The tooth is attested with respect to eating what is appropriate to it. The foot is attested with respect to smashing as it walks. The attested ox, the ox that causes damage. That one is the funniest one, actually. The ox that causes, but I'll explain why. The ox that causes damage in the domain of the one damaged, and the human. The wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the panther, and the serpent, these are attested. Rabbi Eliezer says, when they're domesticated, they're not attested, and the serpent is always attested. Mu'ad le'olam. Okay, here's my argument in brief. I want to claim that the reason this Mishnah is so difficult to understand is that it's doing something new. It's crafting a discourse about animal nature. The incomprehensibility comes from the fact that the Mishnah is crafting this discourse out of biblical materials that don't lend themselves very well to the project. I want to draw on the traditional tools of my trade, which is rabbinic literary source criticism and historical contextualization. And I want to integrate those methods with those of animal studies and to see what we can come up with. So let me take you through this Mishnah step by step. The Mishnah starts with a numbered list, as Mishnah chapters actually often do. It tells us there are 5 toms. I'll explain that word in a minute. And it tells us there are 5 muads, 5 attested sources of damage. I'll explain that in a minute. But I just wanted to quickly point out that there's actually an extra list snuck into this Mishnah that it doesn't tell you about at the start, but it's there. You'll notice this list of what I'm going to call dangerous animals is also 5. I believe it's 5. I hope I counted right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, I think the serpent is kind of a little bit shaky on that list. So let's say we've got these 3 lists. You've got one list of what's called 5 innocent sources of damage, one list of 5 attested sources of damage, and then this extra list of these particular species that are listed. So let me explain now. What do tom and muad mean? When I talk about this attested and unattested, what's that all about? I've translated them with these terms attested and unattested, but it's actually really kind of funny. If you open up different translations of the Mishnah, you see translators really don't know what to do with these terms. They're very strange terms. So one possibility is the Mishnah is getting these terms from the Bible. That's sort of true, but not completely true. Let me explain what I mean. So Exodus 21 and 22, on which much of the Mishnah's animal torts are based, doesn't use these terms, but it does use similar terms. So let's see. It uses the term huad, which is the past tense of muad. And GPS, this is the Jewish Publication Society translation, translates it as warned. So what's happening here? The word here refers to the fact that an owner of an ox has been warned that his ox has shown some tendency to be aggressive. Now, here's why that matters. If the owner has received such a warning and doesn't exercise appropriate care in restraining the ox, then, as you'd expect, the owner possesses a greater degree of liability if his ox then goes and attacks someone or something. Now, you can't tell from the passage exactly what kind of warning they have in mind. It's like, what are they supposed to be what are they supposed to be told? Who's supposed to tell them? But it's some kind of information conveyed that is supposed to have an impact on the behavior of the owner such that he holds back the animal. So that's Exodus. The Mishnah, by contrast, let's see how the Mishnah shifts these terms and these concepts. The Mishnah turns muad into a formal, abstract term. And the Mishnah partners that term muad with this new term that the Mishnah completely makes up, tam. The two terms then together in the Mishnah refer not to this issue of does the owner know that they have a bad ox? Does the owner not know? Did they get this warning? No. These terms now refer to whether this animal is exhibiting normal or abnormal behavior. Look back at the text. In the first 5. An animal is not attested as a source of damage with respect to goring, butting, biting, squatting, or kicking. The shift first, just notice, we've moved from Exodus's particularized ox, Exodus talks about an ox, to talking about a generic animal, a behemoth. So we've kind of expanded the scope of Exodus. But also, look, when the Mishnah declares the behemoth to be unattested for these 5 activities, what is it saying? It's saying that for these 5 things, you can't expect an ox to engage in these behaviors. These are weird things for oxen to do. Maybe not weird, but they're not typical behavior. The Mishnah's claim is oxen don't typically walk around goring, butting, biting, squatting, or kicking. Now, on a certain level, in terms of the basic law, the Mishnah hasn't moved very far from Exodus because the principle of liability is the same, which is if the owner can't predict the animal's behavior, then he's less liable for the harm the animal causes. But here's where things have changed. Whereas for Exodus, that predictability hinges on what? It hinges on this warning, on this particular information that the owner of the ox would get. For the Mishnah, it hinges on something different. It hinges on a scheme of behavioral norms that the Mishnah itself produces. The Babylonian Talmud, when it comments on this Mishnah, actually makes this innovation very clear. And it talks about the Mishnah in Aramaic in terms of orche and lav orche. In other words, what's normal for the animal and what's not normal for the animal. Okay, so the Mishnah is now going to contrast these behaviors it has ascertained to be abnormal, aggressive behaviors, with behaviors it's going to claim are normal behaviors. So those are the Tommy. So let's read. The tooth is attested with respect to eating what is appropriate to it. The foot is attested with respect to smashing as it walks. Okay, this may be the weirdest part of the Mishnah because it's using these body parts. I wasn't sure whether to capitalize tooth or not capitalize tooth. It's using body parts of the animal to represent the animal's normal behaviors of walking and eating. I've taught this material a couple of times, and I'm sure this happens in the yeshiva when they're studying these torts texts, is that you start talking about shen and regel, foot and tooth, as tort categories, totally abstract categories, and you completely forget that they actually refer to like a real body part, a tooth and a foot. So another shift to observe here from the biblical materials to the rabbinic ones is that while Exodus uses the word huad to refer to cases where the animal has exhibited unusually aggressive behavior, here huad, so attested, actually refers to humdrum behavior, to just normal walking and eating, because that's what you can expect. So now we're up to number 3, the attested ox. Now, 3 just sounds redundant. The attested ox is, we're being told the attested ox is on a list of attested creatures. Like, okay, it's on this list, we know it's attested. This would appear to refer to an ox who's exhibited, so this is just exactly Exodus's ox. And you can picture it. They're very concrete scenarios. You can picture there's some guy in ancient Palestine. He owns an ox who's got a bad temper. This ox has sort of been aggressive a few times. The owner's heard about it. It's up to the owner to make sure that ox is held in carefully so that it doesn't keep up its bad behavior. That's the attested ox. This is an ox who has shown that the abnormal for him is normal. We assume it's not like this for most oxen, but for some oxen, they're just cranky, and you just have to expect that. This is the case Exodus has in mind, the ox whose owner has been warned about him. And we can kind of clue into that, because notice we shift from the generic language of animal to now this more specific language of ox. So it kind of keys us back into the biblical materials that it's drawing from. But this redundancy, what I want to say about that, actually points to the way that the Mishnah has so departed from the framework of Exodus, such that now, when Exodus's conception is thrown in the middle of this Mishnah, it actually seems anomalous or strange, even though that was the original conception that gave birth to all these different ways of thinking about ox behavior. So I'm going to skip 4 and 5 on the list and talk about this extra list of muats: the wolf, the lion, the bear, the leopard, the panther, the serpent. Rabbi Eliezer says when they're domesticated, they are not attested, and the serpent is always attested. Now, attested is not the right translation here. Dangerous is. Unlike the domesticated animal, for whom aggressive behavior is considered abnormal, for these species, aggressive behavior is considered normal. You can expect danger. Colin Dayan, in her book, The Law is a White Dog, refers to this phenomenon within the law of certain species being described as dangerous. So I'll read from her. She says, the classification of animals as dangerous is a highly arbitrary legislative act. The animal's suspected innate character or vicious propensity replaces objective characteristics and even evidence of wrongdoing, thus making the uncertain boundaries between legal and illegal, necessary and arbitrary, still more indeterminate. You can think of various animal species in our culture that we tend to dramatize as dangerous. I had a great student presentation in a course I taught last semester who talked about Jaws and the shark and all of the shark phobia that was generated by that movie. Or I think also about pit bulls and how hard it is to find a home for a pit bull and these cultural associations with danger of certain species. That's really the idea here in this Mishnah. An owner of any member of this muad species is expected to pay full damages, whether his animal has that bad track record or not. They could be the sweetest leopard on the planet, but you can expect it to have attacked, and therefore it's the owner's liability to pay full if the animal does. An exception is made by Rabbi Eliezer for cases where the animal has been domesticated. But even Rabbi Eliezer's exception fails for what? The snake. The snake is incorrigible. There's no hope for the snake, which is perhaps not surprising given all the cultural baggage that we have with the snake. But I would also suggest there's probably a lot of cultural baggage here with these other dangerous species on this list. And I think of the exotic animals of imperial spectacles, and we've got large theaters in Rome and Palestine at this time that would have been displaying these guys. Because you ask yourself, well, what did the Mishnah know of leopards, bears, and panthers? And is that running around ancient Palestine? And I think not, but I think they may have been shown in the arena. Which takes us back to the overpowering Gentile motif with which we started. But before I wrap up on this Mishnah, I want to backtrack to one of the muads I skipped. And that's man. That's the Adam, the human being. Adam functions here as a kind of connective. You can see he's right in between the list of humdrum ox activities, eating and walking, and the dangerous species that come right after him. It's hard to know what to make of the human being showing up here, whether we're meant to see him as more like the ox just kind of plodding along, eating some grass, or if we're meant to see him as more clustered with the bear, panther, and other kinds of vicious species whom you can't trust. Either way, the human's presented as just another species you have to watch out for that could cause you damage. So let me draw some conclusions about this passage using a mixture of source criticism, historiography, and animal studies. Okay, so first, source criticism. Judith Hauptmann has compared this Mishnah with its partner passage in the Tosefta. She argues that the Tosefta here is the earlier text, and that the Tosefta actually uses muad. If I had decided to teach the Tosefta tonight, your brain would be less scrambled right now. That it uses muad in a more consistent way than does the Mishnah. And Hauptmann argues that the Mishnah is building on the Tosefta, complicating the Tosefta. It has its reasons, its rational reasons, which is structural. It uses this list to then, if we could study the whole chapter and whole tractate tonight, you would see it yourselves. It actually uses this list to structure all the material that's coming. So it's got this reason. It wants to have these different categories show up here. But I think Hauptmann's argument about the source development is persuasive, and I would just add, I think it's really interesting if you compare the Mishnah and Tosefta, that this strange attested ox, who I suggested to you, he sort of gives the lie, I think, to the Mishnah's innovations. He seems weird, and you get this feeling of how far we've come from Exodus. It's interesting to see how the Tosefta actually doesn't list that particular entity. So let me now historically situate this Mishnah. And here's how I would spell out the implications of the Mishnah in what I hope is a pithy way. Domesticated animals are not normally aggressive on the level of species, but individually they may be. Some animal species are inherently aggressive, though individually they may not be. Some animal species are incorrigibly aggressive, possibly including people, definitely including the snake. One can and should construe all this as an exercise in torts liability. But a broader look at the cultural universe of the Mishnah suggests that something more might be at stake. Robert Lamberton writes in his study of Plutarch, here's what he says. In Plutarch's time, and this is about the same time as the Mishnah, the debate about the similarity between animal and human souls was broadening into a widespread concern with the proper relations between humans and animals. Early Christian texts address these issues as well. And so what I want to suggest is that this Mishnah here is participating in this widespread, whether it knows it or not, is participating in this widespread cultural conversation about the character of other animal species and how it relates to the character of the human species. Okay, all this means that this Mishnah engages what I believe to be some central concerns of animal studies. One, the construction of the animal as a homogenized entity. Two, the attribution to the animal of certain natural qualities or pseudoscientific or common sense claims. The exacting here of punishment or resources based on these putative natural qualities. And finally, commonly found, a production of an opposition between wild and domesticated, with human domestication associated with peacefulness and control. But I think the Mishnah also complicates some of these claims. Human domestication, for instance, is associated with control and greater peacefulness, but it doesn't seem that human beings themselves are actually associated that way. Okay, let me now think back. Let's all think back to the Mishnah with which I started. Here, I'll put it up on them. The human being, the Adam, of that Mishnah is the Jewish man whose seclusion with a Gentile threatens him with murder. The Adam of this Mishnah that we've been discussing, on the other hand, is more the Adam of the human species, who is himself a threat to people, animals, and objects around him. Likewise, the behemoth or animal of that first Mishnah is the Jew's animal, whose stay at the Gentiles' inn threatens that animal with sexual violation. The behemoth of this Mishnah, on the other hand, the one that we've been discussing, is a more generic behemoth. And here the animal in this Mishnah that we've been discussing isn't the target of violence, he's the perpetrator, or she. What we see is that the human and animal binary, even just between these two Mishnahs, who come relatively close to each other in the corpus of the Mishnah, that this binary gets wielded very differently in these two contexts. Even while certain problems remain constant, we can see certain patterns of concern in the treatment. These problems include the proprietary relationship between the human and the animal, such that the animal's violence, whether as a victim, whether as a perpetrator, is very consequential for the human owner, to the point where they could be executed for the act of their animal. We see also a preoccupation with abnormal aggression. In the first Mishnah, attached to Gentile men. In the second Mishnah, attached to cranky oxen. The themes that are central to this Mishnah, damages caused by or to one's property, defining behavioral norms, these are classic concerns of the law. I imagine you would find them in almost any legal system. But what I'm proposing is that if we look carefully at how these problems are formulated within rabbinic law, if we ask the right questions with the help of other fields like animal studies, using the conventional approaches that we take in rabbinics, like historiography and source criticism, that we can learn a great deal, not just about the history of rabbinic law or even the history of law, but the history of human self-conceptions. Okay, so you might have noticed that the title of my talk, promised, Escaping Elephants and Clever Oxen. And I don't want to let you down. So let me say a few final words about these interesting creatures. I restricted myself to the Mishnah tonight. It's a little simpler to try to teach Mishnah. But the Babylonian Talmud's commentary on the Mishnah offers a wealth of materials about animals that's really just waiting to be mined. And so I'm just going to give you a tiny tidbit of two cases. In one famously eccentric passage, the Talmud asks, is it permissible to build a sukkah using an elephant as one of its walls? Okay, and this, I don't know how I came up with this. I thought this was pretty funny. Someone with a sense of humor and Talmud study background. So the Talmud is actually quite practical in its response to this question. It's permissible so long as the animal is tied down, since otherwise the elephant or another kind of animal, like any other sane creature who's stuck in a spot for 7 days of Sukkah, would probably try to run away. Another Talmud passage, a favorite of mine, which is the last text on the handout, talks about an ox who can act with intention, purposefully, to light a fire on the Sabbath. And the issue here is it's only such labor on the Sabbath, like purposeful, intentional labor, productive labor, that makes one liable. So the question is, can an animal perform that kind of purposeful act? And the Talmud finds evidence for such an animal in Rav Papa's ox. And I couldn't find a Google image for Rav Papa's ox. So I thought there must have been someone who would have come up with it, but no. But so just imagine it yourselves. Rav Papa once had an ox, we are told, whose toothache led him to the beer barrels, where he took a swig of beer in order to soothe his pain. This clever ox, as the Talmud calls him, and the Sukkah escaping elephant are just two of the many wonderful animals waiting to join the world of animal studies. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
In the Mishnah Bava Kama, there's a distinction between domesticated animals and other animals. I have two questions. The first one is, does that distinction occur in many other Mishnah? And the second point is that number one and number two, tooth is attested with respect to and foot is attested with respect to, seems to have a different meaning than the difference between domesticated and wild animals, because wild animals are attested and domesticated or not. What's the connection between 1 and 2 and what is being said about domesticated and wild animals?
Yeah, I wasn't sure what you meant by 1 and 2. You're saying the tooth.
Number one, the tooth is attested with respect to, and 2, the foot is attested with respect to. That meaning doesn't seem to be the same as the difference between domesticated and wild, the way in which you use it, or you translate attested later on in the Mishnah.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. It's confusing. It's a totally different understanding of attested. The reason the tooth and the foot are attested is because you should expect that those animals will do those things. Because what's a cow's favorite activity? It's walking around eating grass. That's what they do all day long. So if you let your cow onto your neighbor's field and they eat up everything, that was your job to make sure that they didn't do that, because you had every reason to expect that's exactly what your cow would have done if given the chance. So the parallel just has to do with what you should expect and what your responsibilities are. So in that case, we're talking about very humdrum behavior that you could expect and therefore become liable for. And in the other cases, we're talking about aggressive behavior that you could expect because the assumption is these are inherently aggressive animals, if not domesticated. And so you can expect that they'll wreak damage, and therefore you are totally responsible if they do. And in terms of that distinction being made elsewhere, the phrase is b'nei tarbut, which is an interesting phrase. You have to look up how exactly the rabbis use the word tarbut. It's the modern Hebrew word for culture. So it literally means like sons of culture, part of culture. So I don't know. I think I once looked it up, and now I can't remember what the results were of how often it comes up, because it is an interesting phrase.
So apropos of the connection between human beings and animals broadly, which you've taken apart for us here, I mean, it's very interesting to me that we have in this passage, as you were saying, animals that might have been part of Roman spectacle. But I'm curious about the contrary case. What does the Talmud have to say about dogs, where the relationship, where the domestication process, is it called that? And if so, what kinds of responsibilities rest upon dogs and human beings by virtue of that very close relationship between these two species?
Yeah, dogs come up once in the Mishnah, and it's, I think what it says there is just that they have to be tethered. They have to have a chain.
So why aren't dogs a greater interest?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find interesting about all this torts liability stuff in this tractate is it stays really close to biblical models. Like, it always comes back to the ox and to the kinds of things that come up in the Bible. And it does here and there start to, like, it pulls in these other species that don't come up in the Bible. But it seems like the gravitational center are the biblical animals. They kind of define the discourse. But then you get these moments where they start talking about other species. So that one place where they talk about, they don't talk about cats in the Mishnah, but the Tosefta talks about cats. And there's if any cat lovers are out here, I apologize to you now, because the Talmud has really nasty legislation about cats. It tells this interesting, I'm actually supposed to write my AAR paper about this, so I'm going to spend some time with it. But there's a story that gets told about a number of great rabbis who are going to like a bar mitzvah or a bris. It's actually unclear what kind of event they're going to. I think it's a bris because there's a baby involved. And I think the story is making fun of the rabbis because the whole start of the story is like each rabbi is like 3 or 4. They each say, you go first. No, you go first. No, I should go first. It's like they're really caught up in like the hierarchy and preserving the hierarchy properly. And in the meantime, this cat that's running around bites off the arm of the baby who they're there to celebrate. And I think, here's my reading of the story, is that I think it's Rav feels so guilty about this or realizes that he's implicated in what happened that he emerges from the story with these super harsh legislations about cats that basically says, like, you can go kill a cat wherever you find them and they don't register as property, so you can really do what you want with them.
I've done some research on the subject because I've been involved in animal protection work here and in Israel for a very long time. And not only the ancient sources, the Tanakh and the Talmud and so on, but going all the way to modern literature, especially Yiddish literature, it's my feeling that there's a definite sense of the need to be kind to animals, to not misuse them, to not torture them. Many rabbis spoke up against everything in that regard. For example, in the Talmud it says whoever sits in a stadium where animals and humans were killing each other spills blood, and people were warned in the Middle Ages against spurring horses because it was cruel to horses, and so on and so forth. Is it your impression that animal studies is interested in this very specific and very interesting field ethical issues regarding the treatment of animals that runs all the way through Judaism? Is this something of interest to animal studies people who are creating the field, in essence?
I mean, I'd say the same thing of animal studies that I'd say of Jewish studies, which is I often find the field kind of skews modern, which makes sense because we live in the modern period and people are interested in things that feel more immediate. So I'm on an animal studies listserv, so I see all the conferences and the volumes that people put together. And generally, it has to do with things happening today or the past, century or two. But there certainly is interest in historical traditions and excavating the past as a way to understand the present, or just to understand the past as a good thing unto itself. So I think, that the thrust of the field is, as you say, towards the modern, but I think these ancient texts, there are people who are interested, and then it's my job to make them interesting.
Hi, I'm certainly not a scholar, but I'm certainly not in this area. I was reading something in the paper a couple of weeks ago about a zookeeper, person who worked on, I don't remember which animal it was, but he went into the cage and seems to have forgotten that quick motions would disturb the animal, and he was attacked. And he made the point of saying he didn't want the animal to be blamed. So I'm wondering, in terms of the human animal, whether he was dangerous to himself. And does animal studies is there a way of not making the distinction between other kinds of creatures and human animals? Like, what got in the way that this person would have forgotten not to make quick motions and then puts himself in harm? So this may have nothing to do with this, but it jogged my memory of reading this article.
I'm fascinated by the human coming up there. And I think maybe it really deconstructs the whole exercise, actually, because when I think about the question of are humans dangerous, that's such a complicated question to answer. Like, sometimes some people seem really dangerous, some people seem a little less threatening, but probably anyone has kind of a dangerous side if they're provoked enough. So it's like there's so many factors involved in danger. And then that makes me wonder, well, that's probably true in all these other cases too. Like, it's very hard to define what constitutes danger to self, danger to others. And I guess that's what the law's project is to try to come up with some guiding principles, because at the end of the day, if there's an attack, someone has to pay, and you have to figure out who's at fault. But the project of figuring out who's at fault and who should have known what beforehand, it feels like a very murky thing.
I'm wondering, what I noticed, especially in your last two sources, are comparing animals to human beings, anthropomorphizing. When the reverse happens, such as a nickname for a person as a lion, or we can learn, that Talmudic passage in Eruvin, we can learn modesty from a cat. Do you find it, what are the salient features that you find when animalizing people, not in this raucous, terrible way, but promoting the nobility of animals? Can you say a little bit about that and what you've seen as salient features in that?
I guess both anthropomorphizing animals and animalizing people, you can think of as kind of just wholly negative types of dynamics, but it's interesting. And I think people just do have this attraction to animals and curiosity about animals. And I mean, I see my daughters like really mimicking animals. Like we have this thing that draws us, I think, sometimes to other species. And so I don't think that's bad or that we should thwart that. I think it's something to exploit and can enhance our relationship to other species if we can take that attraction and try to understand it and enhance it. I guess it's just where it turns bad is, or I don't know if bad, but it's just, I mean, I think what happens, it actually reminds me of what I was saying with tooth and foot. We start talking about animal bodies, and we kind of forget that that's what we're talking about. And if you call someone a lion, or we use these, or a bitch, like you kind of forget that it even has that animal meaning. So I think a lot of times we bring other species into our culture, and then they kind of lose their original meaning or any kind of connection to the animal world. And I don't, maybe that's not something to judge as good or bad, it's just what happens.
So as somebody whose first name means bear,
Yeah.
definitely is a bad rap, as we can see from this Mishnah as well as many other sources.
That's right.
I want to thank you for bringing to light.
Redeeming the bear.
Well, I don't know about redeeming. But in any event, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the Mishnah often uses the biblical references. So could it be that since the first part of the Mishnah ends with the human, and the second part of the Mishnah ends with the serpent, and we know that the last statement, and the serpent is always attested, there's a parallel statement, the human is always attested in another Mishnah, Adam Muad La'olam. So could it be that, in fact, Mishnah is riffing on the first two stories of conflict violence of Genesis? The serpent, of course, and the fratricide of Cain and Abel, and the human. And that may be a subtext here, that in fact there is a deep parallel between human violence and between conflict between animal and human.
Yeah, and I assume part of what you're suggesting is that has something to do with the intellect, with that sneaky smartness, that may somehow create danger.
As I'm listening, both to your presentation and to the comments and the questions afterwards, I'm back in Roman Palestine, and thinking about how animals are functioning in the lives of the people, and the ox is a work animal, and even the dog that's not mentioned is a work animal primarily, guarding or herding. These other animals are, if they are the animals of the spectacles, so there's a different relationship, I suspect. We in the first world, very often in the 21st century, when animals are not primarily work animals, even horses are either pets or they're racing animals, we have a very different relationship to animals. And I'm wondering how that very, very different kind of understanding either affects or skews or something our understanding of these texts, and how these binaries and these distinctions are functioning in the rabbi's self-understanding.
So I'm teaching an introduction to Judaism, which is really challenging, and I was teaching a class yesterday on modern Yiddish literature, which I know nothing about, but pretended to. And I taught an amazing story by Mendele Mocher Sforim called The Calf. And I think it's a famous story. Maybe some of you have read it. But it's about a little shtetl farm family where the cow gives birth to a calf, and the mother is going to, sell it to market to get slaughtered. And crazy things happen, and somehow it's sort of like Charlotte's Web. Told the students it was kind of a Yiddish Charlotte's Web, but the calf ends up getting saved. But it's all about this boy's relationship to the calf and how much joy it brings him, and he's out in the fields and just, like the calf is the only bright spot in his life. And it's a critique of the yeshiva, and there's all this stuff happening in the story. But it does make me wonder if I'm thinking, because I also think, like, well, I have a golden retriever, and she's so cute, and it's like, I kind of romanticize animals and have this, like, very cute relationship with my animal, and I try not to put that on every animal and every human-animal relationship, but then I do wonder, even in settings where animals are there for a purpose, not just to be best friends with the owner, but they're there to give milk or wool or to work or whatever it is, to be slaughtered, that these relationships could still develop and that there is something more complicated than just like, either you have a tractor or you have an animal. That there is something different about a living being that creates a different experience than it would if it were just an inanimate object. And so those are the texts I'm actually especially interested in, is where are the texts? And that's why this one was of interest to me. But I've really tried to find the text where the rabbis are really thinking about who animals are. Like, how do animals operate? What do they think? What can they plan? And how can we understand their patterns? And so I'm really interested in the depth of the relationships that do seem to happen.
There's an interesting parallel to the list of the dangerous animals, which comes up in the first chapter of Mishnah Sanhedrin, in which the same list are among those, as well as the ox that is to be killed, are tried by a court of 23, which is the same court that tries a person for capital crimes. And then there's a comment of Rabbi Eliezer who says that if someone goes out and kills one of the dangerous animals themselves, they gain merit. And so I was hoping for comments on that parallel Mishnah.
Yeah, I find Colin Dion's remarks especially helpful for that one, because in that Mishnah, the claim is made. So backing up. So this is a crazy phenomenon in ancient Judaism that more people should know about and think about because it's so interesting, is animal trials, which you may know took place in France, in sort of early modern France, even I think continuing in today in Western Europe or Spain. But in ancient Jewish law, you have trials, like a full judge court trying an animal for a couple different crimes. And, but there's one opinion that if it's one of these dangerous animals, that they actually don't have the right to a trial. And that you can just go and kill them straight away before they've been brought to justice, because you can just assume they're like really bad. And it's almost like, I guess I think about like the idea of like going after a terrorist. And you don't have to use judicial procedure because the danger kind of throws the law out the window. So there's a similar idea with these kinds of animals, and it is interesting. So it has very serious implications when certain species are considered dangerous. They actually lose a lot of legal rights.
Beth, thank you. As always, I learned so much from you. I wanted to broaden this out to some comments that you made at the very beginning where you were talking about animal studies as a field and the kind of challenge that it brings to the humanities as a collection of disciplines and kind of post-humanistic mode of study. And what it sparked for me was to think about, in the history of comparative religion, one of the things that we see is that in the colonial encounter between Europeans and peoples of other places, that there was an absence of recognition of the presence of something called religion, right, among other peoples. And having religion was a determining element of the definition of the human, right? So it became a power dynamic whereby if these other peoples don't have religion, then they're not really human, so we can, kill them and take their stuff, right? And so what I'm trying to then think about in your very provocative comment that animal studies might make us think about the human and the boundaries differently, if then, what then the implication is for thinking about religion, right? And is it the case that we can ascribe religiosity only to members of our species, or would you expand it in different kinds of ways? Or how do these different things sort of come together? And you don't necessarily have to have a full-baked answer for that, but I just wondered if you could reflect on it.
I have a half-baked answer.
Okay, excellent.
Some of the stuff I've looked at lately, just, kind of more popular works that have come out. Something came out on animal grief, because that's a big topic. Is it okay possibly to kill animals because they don't understand that their life's being cut short? It's not something they can anticipate, and then it's not something they feel the loss of. And so there's a question of, do animals understand death? Can they anticipate death? And can they react? Can they grieve? And so there's all this work on actually grieving practices among animals. And so I don't know what the jump from that kind of thing is to religious practice. It seems to me like grief rituals are actually like kind of a big piece of religious practice. I haven't seen specifically anyone arguing for animal religion, though I think it's out there. But I think that might be like the next area that gets discussed, if it's not already happening. And then it would just raise the question of how do we think about religion? Like maybe it'll really change how we think about religion.